Tuesday morning. I'm Michelle Edmonds with Idaho News 6. We have a lot of education news to get to, and joining me, as he has been for years now on Making the Grade, my buddy, my partner, Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News,
Hi,
keeping busy
Michelle.
and keeping healthy, right, Kev?
Busy for sure and healthy so far, yes. Got to stay healthy. There's so much to write about right now.
There is. We have so many topics to get to here on Making the Grade. And one of the fun things, if I can call it that, during the midst of this pandemic crisis we have been in, is that we have been able to have great interaction with our viewers during Making the Grade. So if you're joining us live here on Facebook, we'd love to get your input, your thoughts, your questions as we discuss a number of education topics. We're talking from school reopening to lawsuits being filed to something you might vote on in November, and even a Supreme Court ruling that just came down this morning. So we're going to get to it all. But Kevin, as we've been starting and where most people want us to start is with how are schools going to reopen in the fall? And there's a committee that's looking into this, but even they are struggling a little bit to meet their own deadlines.
Well, and they set a very ambitious deadline. I mean, this is a committee that was put together just very recently with the goal of trying to get guidelines in the hands of school officials by the end of this month. Well, they're not going to hit that deadline. They're going to meet again on Thursday, hopefully get guidelines in the hands of local school officials by sometime next week. Because the decision is ultimately going to be made at the local level. It's going to be school superintendents and trustees and administrators trying to decide what school looks like in the fall. This is strictly an advisory committee, but it's one that educators are watching closely.
It's a non-binding agreement. And as we're scrolling through here, you can see they are using on this committee, this isn't just politicians. We need to make sure of that. There are a few politicians on here, but when I looked through this, it is mostly school educators, administrators, different districts.
A lot of educators. And ultimately, educators are the ones who are going to have to make this decision. It's a very different dynamic than we saw in the spring, where the state board essentially closed schools for the spring. They closed schools for about a month. And then with the guidelines that were used towards the end of the school year, in accordance with the governor's Idaho rebounds plan, the reopening plan, essentially kept schools closed for the year and required schools to go to their local health district to get buy-in on reopening plans. That's not going to be the case this fall. School districts, charter schools are going to be able to make that decision without getting approval from the local health districts.
Which, as we've seen, Kevin, local health districts are making different decisions. Obviously, last week bringing Ada County back into phase 3 of reopening. So it is going to be a very localized issue with what school districts can open, will open, should open, all those questions out there.
Right. If you think it's a different, if you think it's kind of inconsistent, if you look at 7 different health districts and 44 counties, there's going to be a lot of variation when we get down to 115 school districts and 60 or 70 charter schools, depending on how you count the charter schools. A lot of decisions are going to be made locally. It's going to be a big part of our job to just figure out who's open, who's closed, and under what guidelines.
What do you expect? Do you have any expectations about what's going to come out of the governor's committee for reopening? Have there been any hints about exactly what these guidelines look like? Because if we're talking about the district health departments and what their guidelines will be, of course, they're sitting on this committee as well. Isn't it one of those where some of these guidelines may go by the wayside come fall?
Well, we know the governor is very bullish about the idea of getting schools reopened for the fall, and he's not alone on that. The surveys that we've seen in West Ada and Boise show that the parents are generally supportive of the idea of reopening. They want to make sure that it can be done safely, as does everybody. So I think that going into it, I would expect this committee is going to try to be as permissive as possible, as encouraging as possible, try to come up with guidelines that will try to enable schools to open and give them a path to open as safely as possible, some suggestions and guidelines in that direction. But we'll see. And we're going to have those guidelines probably fairly soon.
Well, we certainly hope so, and I know school districts are waiting for them as well. We're starting to get a few comments in. Of course, we're here on Making the Grade. I'm Michelle Edmonds with Idaho News 6, here with Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News. Let's talk a little bit about the academic standards that are being rewritten even during the midst of coronavirus. There was a first meeting with the mathematics standards that was put into place this week. And Kevin, first of all, before we get into the logistics of the meeting itself and some of the issues that happened there, can you tell me a little bit about the rewriting of the standards and why this is happening?
Well, it's happening because we've had a debate about this for the past 5 legislative sessions. The academic standards, namely in math and English language arts and science, have been very controversial at the State House. What happened this past legislative session was that the House and Senate couldn't agree on what they wanted the standards to look like this year, but they agreed on the idea of putting together a committee, a legislative committee, to look at rewriting the academic standards with the idea of changing the standards to get away from the Common Core aligned standards that we have in math and English language arts, and also rewriting the science standards that have been debated about so vigorously at the State House for the past several years. Now, you also have State Department of Education committees looking at the nuts and bolts of what these standards might look like. So this has been a long time coming. This has been a hot button issue at the State House for a long time. So now this summer, we're getting down to the beginning of the process of what will the new standards look like? How will the rewrite work? What will change, and how will that affect schools that have to come up with a curriculum that aligns to a new set of standards?
And as we've seen, as you and I are covering the State House over this issue, these are contentious meetings that bring packed houses, which is why it's important that in this Zooming day and age that we're now living in, that the governor's orders be followed, that these sorts of public meetings be public. And the first round of the math standards rewriting was certainly not public in the beginning.
It was not a good start in terms of transparency. There's no getting around that. The meeting was scheduled to begin and did begin at 10 o'clock on Monday morning. If you were trying to tune in at 10 a.m. to get in on the start of the meeting, you were out of luck. There was no way into the meeting until the State Department of Education came back and issued the passwords to allow folks to log on and listen. That happened about 45 minutes into the meeting. And instead of stopping the meeting and trying to get the access issues resolved, the committee just kept on working and kept the start of the meeting going. So the first chunk of the first meeting occurred in radio silence. That's not a good way to begin this process at all from a transparency standpoint.
What did Idaho Education News hear from the State Department of Education over this?
I think they made it out to be, kind of a mix-up in terms of getting the password information out. But I guess still, I go back to, you started the meeting. We flagged that there was a problem with access. We were having a hard time getting in. And the meeting proceeded for, like I said, about 45 minutes before the passwords were issued. And that's a concern. And you mentioned the governor and you mentioned the guidelines during the pandemic. The guidelines have been pretty clear that government agencies have to make sure that that meetings are accessible to the public. Even in a climate where it's impossible to access meetings face to face, you have to be able to access them in a virtual setting.
And transparency is key, especially in a hot button issue coming out of the State Department of Education. There will be many more of these meetings coming up. So how does the public get involved if they do want to be able to see these meetings?
Well, hopefully there will be a better mechanism in place for future meetings so that people will be able to access the meetings. And, as you said, it's a long process. We will be on top of it. We'll try to keep people as surprised as possible at idahoednews.org about when meetings are coming up and how you can listen and get involved.
Another huge topic that Idaho Education News has been writing about for months now, the legal wranglings over the group called Reclaim Idaho. And you might understand Reclaim Idaho, you might remember them, not necessarily from education, but from Medicaid expansion. Back in 2018, they were the group, the nonprofit group that pushed for Medicaid expansion in the state, got it on the ballot, and of course that passed. They are now into a project, a $170 million voter initiative in order to fund education in a whole new way. And they had to get enough signatures, obviously, Kevin, as we know the process, to get this issue on the November ballot. And that's where the hiccup came in with coronavirus in March.
Right. That's where this, like you said, there was a hiccup. I mean, Reclaim Idaho was gathering signatures in mid-March, proceeding towards an April 30th deadline to try to get the necessary signatures to get this initiative on the ballot. Then the pandemic struck. The group suspended its operations, suspended its face-to-face signature gathering in the face of a pandemic. And then the issue gets really complicated, and then it becomes a legal matter. Reclaim Idaho says that it tried to talk to the governor's office, talk to the Secretary of State's office to try to come up with some sort of an alternative route, some way to gather signatures and continue the campaign, even when face-to-face signature gathering is on hold. The group says that the governor and the Secretary of State rebuffed those efforts, gave the group no path forward, no plan B. So Reclaim Idaho took the case to federal court, and just last week, federal judge B. Lynn Windmill ruled in the group's favor and said that yes, the state's inaction constituted a violation of Reclaim Idaho's First Amendment rights because it made it impossible for the group to get its initiative on the ballot. So here's where we are at this point. Federal judge has ordered the state do something to accommodate Reclaim Idaho. And the options that he presented last week, well, there were two. He said you could either put the initiative on the ballot straight away, kind of suspend the whole signature gathering process and just qualify the initiative based on the signatures that had already been collected pre-COVID-19, or you can provide a mechanism for Reclaim Idaho to gather signatures electronically and give the group 48 days to finish the job and try to meet a revised deadline to get back on the ballot. The state has opted for neither and has said it's going to appeal this case to the Circuit Court of Appeals. And basically, they asked Windmill to set aside his ruling from last week to allow the appeal to go forward. The judge said, no, my ruling remains in place. And on Monday, as Windmill was issuing that order saying that he's not going to stay his decision from last week, he still wants to proceed under the ruling from last week, Reclaim Idaho went to court and said, we're filing a motion asking the court to put this initiative on the ballot because at this point it's clear to the group they feel like the state is not going to cooperate, is not going to accommodate, and is not going to honor the judge's ruling. So they're asking the judge to put the ballot initiative before voters, no questions asked. So a lot of legal wrangling still to come. We're waiting to see. We anticipate the state filing its appeal with the circuit court could come any day now. So this is far from resolved. But spin it forward. You talked about, is this going to be on the ballot in November? If it is on the ballot, this is $170 million of increases in income taxes, increases in corporate taxes geared towards funding K-12. Reclaim Idaho has said that this is going to be something that could potentially reduce some of the pressure on property taxes, on supplemental levies, on voters facing supplemental levies, as we've seen in district upon district. It's going to be a very heated debate if this gets on the ballot. I would imagine that you're going to have folks on both sides, probably a good deal of money put into a campaign on this kind of an initiative. This is the kind of thing that will get statewide lobbying groups, maybe even some national attention.
And it'll be fascinating just to watch and see what the legal wranglings are here too, because we're in an unprecedented time, and to have a voter initiative hit our ballot without appropriately enough signatures according to what's supposed to happen in normal days, this could be fascinating as we move forward and see where the public stands in all this, but also where the courts stand.
And it's been a very dramatic turnaround, because when Reclaim Idaho suspended its efforts in March, I think a lot of us, myself included, thought that that was the last we were going to hear about this ballot measure in this 2020 election cycle. Well, the lawsuit came on June 8th. Just last week, Judge Windmill issued his ruling and sided with Reclaim Idaho and really put the onus on the state to either comply or, now the state has decided it's going to try its luck in circuit court. This really was unexpected to me, and I think to probably a lot of observers. All of a sudden, we are talking about what would be a major funding shift for K-12 if it passes.
$170 million. That would definitely pay for a lot of teachers. Yeah. Yes. So while we're on the topic of lawsuits, because that's fun to talk about during coronavirus, right? But you posted a story at Idaho Education News talking about State Superintendent Sherry Ibarra's lawsuit. And of course, we have already talked about that lawsuit quite a bit over the last couple of months, and it coming out not in her favor for moving technical jobs from her department to the state board's control. But specifically here, you now have some numbers with how much this lawsuit costs taxpayers. Kevin, give us a little bit of a handle.
We're getting part of that answer, at least. What we found out this week was that the Boise law firm that was hired to represent the legislature, one of the defendants in Superintendent Ibarra's lawsuit, the firm representing the legislature received close to $142,000 over the past couple of months to defend the legislature, and as it turned out, defend the legislature successfully in court. That's only part of the bills for taxpayers. We don't know yet how much David Leroy, the former lieutenant governor and former state attorney general, will get for his work representing Ibarra in the lawsuit. We know that his contract calls for up to $200,000. We don't know how much he will receive, but either way, that's going to be taxpayer funded, as well as the $142,000 that the legislature's attorneys received. We knew this was going to be a spendy lawsuit, and now we're just starting to get some of those numbers.
And we should mention there was a third party involved, and that was the State Board of Education, but they went in-house for their counsel, as you might call it.
Right. They were represented by the Attorney General's office. The legislature opted to go with outside counsel. Superintendent Ibarra was instructed to get outside counsel. The Attorney General's office said, "No, we're not going to be able to represent you in this case." As a result, she hired David Leroy to represent her. He was made into kind of a special deputy attorney general on Ibarra's behalf. We should know, hopefully by next week, exactly how much he was paid for representing Ibarra.
And we go from Idaho courts to the Supreme Court of the United States, yeah. Kevin, where just this morning, a major ruling has come out in education, and it could have serious implications for funding for education in Idaho, specifically when it comes to the idea of school vouchers or funding for religious schools. So this is a story that actually started back in Montana. Can you bring us up to speed on where this case from the Supreme Court came from and what the ruling was today?
Okay, so the upshot in Montana, and a lot of this is going to sound familiar to folks who watch education issues. Montana established a scholarship program that would allow people to receive a tax credit if they contributed to programs to provide scholarships for private schools. The issue became complicated when it centered on the question of whether those scholarships could be used to attend a religious school. That was the crux of the case that went before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled today that a scholarship program like the one in Montana has to be made available to students attending all private schools, including religious schools. Why do we care about this in Idaho when this is a Montana case? Well, the language in Montana's constitution and the language in constitutions in about 36 states, including Idaho, prohibit the use of public dollars to support religious entities, including parochial schools. They're called Blaine amendments, and like I say, widespread across the nation. By the most recent counts that I've seen, about 3 dozen states have Blaine amendments on the books. And what we've seen in Idaho over the past few years is that the Blaine amendment is a strong, it's strongly worded, and it has restricted attempts to try to set up any kind of voucher system. You would have to essentially amend the state's constitution to legalize any kind of a voucher system, and amending the state's constitution is a complicated and a daunting hurdle. So this ruling, and it was a 5-4 ruling, sharply divided Supreme Court, it places the high court's attention on these Blaine amendments in a way that we haven't seen in the past. How that plays out in the 2021 legislative session and beyond, that remains to be seen. But this could encourage folks who've been wanting to take a run at the Blaine amendment to take another shot at trying to tweak Idaho's version of the amendment.
This actually just came out. We were looking at the ruling right there. Chief Justice Roberts.
Maybe 2 pages. We're working my way through and trying to get more of the nuance of it. But the crux of it is, if you have a scholarship program like in Montana, you cannot differentiate between secular private schools and parochial private schools.
Again, just one more thing to put on our plate for the legislative session for 2021, Kevin. We've had a bunch of comments from people. We appreciate you being here for Making the Grade, everybody, talking a lot about whether schools can reopen, how they're going to reopen, how those decisions are going to be made safely. So, Kevin, before we finish up Making the Grade, let's scoot back around on that same topic. Specifically, what have you seen and heard with this school reopening committee? There have been some comments and questions here about whether or not they're getting advice from doctors or pediatricians. And the group that's making up this reopening school committee, which is, again, has non-binding guidelines that are going to be coming out later this week or next week. Are people looking at the science here as well?
I think they have to be looking at the science. And obviously, it's an emerging science. And you would imagine that as school officials contemplate the issues that they're facing, even though the public health districts don't have to sign on to a school's reopening plan, you would think that common sense would dictate that the school districts, that the school administrators and the trustees would reach out to folks in the health community, reach out to the health districts. Health district boards, which are comprised not only of elected officials, but also of medical professionals.
Well, once again, we're going to have a lot to talk about next week. We keep waiting for the summer slowdown. And
I was, texting my colleague, Clark Corbin. We covered the legislature together, and we were looking at what our day looked like. And it's like, it feels like a legislative day only in late June, because, there are several stories that we're looking at and several stories that could break. This is supposed to be 4th of July week too. It's not slowing down.
No, not at all. All right. Do you have some socks to show us?
I do.
You do? Socks and masks. We could go either direction these days.
Gotta have your mask.
You always have your mask. Yes. Good.
Can't leave home without my mask. And as for socks, so obviously it's 4th of July week, but it's also come Friday, the 130th anniversary, Idaho's 130th birthday. So I'm even going to show you that these socks, they go all the way down here. You see?
Oh, I love them.
So happy 130th birthday, Idaho. That is on Friday.
I love it, Kevin. Thank you for always making the day on Making the Grade.